We're telling Bible stories through the Bible, and we have come to just about the end of the northern kingdom of Israel. And we're skipping a lot. But I'd like to explain kind of the history of what's been going on here. Everything in the Old Testament should be seen in the light of what we call the Torah, the Word from God, the Law of Moses on Mount Sinai. But what I mean is, when God rescued His people out of the land of Egypt, and we're talking something that happened almost 1,000 years before the story we're going to talk about today. But it was the history of the people that was supposed to form the very backbone of the people. In fact, even if you go back a little bit further, why is there a nation of Israel at all? If you'll remember, their first forefather, Abraham, was old. Okay? I got married at 32. I was young by New York City standards. Okay? Not by Missouri standards. I was an old man, and now we've had a baby and another one on the way, and I'm 37. And by the time this new baby is 20, I will be old. Depending on how long I last and how well I take care of myself and everything, I will either be playing catch in the backyard or he will be changing my saline bag or whatever, yeah. Changing each other's diapers, yeah. But Abraham's got me beat. At the age of 75, God came to Abraham and said, "You will be the father of a multitude of people that will number so much it will be like trying to count the stars in the sky or the sands on the seashore." And Abraham was 75. His wife Sarah was about 10 years younger than him, so about 65. And God did not fulfill His promise till Abraham was 100. And however long the women were able to have babies back then, she was past it when this conversation started. Well past it. And so the fact that and then Isaac, the son that is born of the promise, he's the progenitor. He is the father of the nation of Israel. So why is there a nation of Israel at all? Because God did a miracle. Okay? We call Israel the chosen people, but they're the people that God created through a miracle of an elderly couple having a child to begin with. So they're not just the chosen people, they're God's people that He made, even in a more special sense than the rest of mankind whom He made. And this special people, they grew into a larger people. They moved to Egypt, and Egypt started to oppress them because they feared how big they were getting, and God delivered them out of Egypt, and He brought them to Mount Sinai and said, "I'm going to come down, mighty God, in fire on the mountain, and I'm going to tell you how to live for me and how to please me." And the deal that God made with the people of Israel on Mount Sinai was, "You will worship only me, and I will bless you. And if you don't worship only me, I will curse you. I will allow bad things to happen. Your crops won't grow. Your children you won't have as many children. Bad fertility in all areas. And the invaders will come from foreign lands, and they will harass you, and they will carry you off if you don't worship only me." God makes this promise to the children of Israel, and throughout the rest of the Old Testament, everything has to do with, are they living up to what God had told them to do or not? Are they worshiping only God? When they are worshiping only God, God blesses them. When they are not, God allows terrible calamity, the Bible usually puts it, to happen to them, whether it's a plague of disease or whether it's invaders or whether it's a drought of rain. And unfortunately, we don't have a ton of examples of Israel being blessed just because they were worshiping only God. What we have is examples of they came back to worshiping God, and God would pull back whatever calamity He had allowed to happen. He was always rescuing them, because only in great distress did they finally decide that they were going to turn back to the Lord. Well, we've told the story of how instead of they were a loosely confederated group of tribes for 400 years under the judges, and then they were united as a kingdom under King Saul, and then King Saul didn't get to have a dynasty. King David, from a totally different tribe, got to be the king. God promised him, if you serve only me, once again, there it is, I will cause your dynasty to last forever. And whenever David did a horrible, grievous sin, adultery, and then he murdered to cover it up, God said, I'm taking the kingdom away from you. I'm not taking the whole kingdom away from you. I'm taking most of the kingdom away from you because I already promised that you would have a son that sits on the throne forever. But the 10 northern tribes broke away from the 1 or 2 tribes in the south, and they called themselves the nation of Israel. That's Judah down there. We're the real nation of Israel. Unfortunately, the nation of Israel, God made the same promise with them. If you continue on, if you worship only me, I will bless you, and if you worship other gods, I will allow bad things to happen to you until you come back to me. And that way the world would see either Israel worships the one true God, and look how he blesses them. Maybe we should worship that God too. Or if they disobeyed, the whole world would be able to see, man, they turned on their God, and look what happened. He must be real. Because things sure went downhill when they turned against him. Unfortunately, the northern kingdom really never got it. Down in the southern kingdom, we're going to have some kings lead the nation in idolatry, and they suffer for it. But thankfully, along comes one of my favorite names in the Bible to say, Jehoshaphat. And he was not David's son, but the Bible describes him as David's son, even though he was like his great-great-grandson or something. But he walked in the ways of his father David. He honored God. And he told, and he's the king. He can say, tear down those idols. You see anybody building an idol to a false god, you bring them in here. You arrest them. You bring them in here before us. And he could outlaw idolatry, and they could worship only God, and things got better. Unfortunately, eventually, and King Hezekiah also was a very good king in the south. So in the south, in the southern kingdom, they would go back and forth. Idolatry, worship only God. Idolatry, worship only God. Unfortunately, Hezekiah eventually has a son named King Manasseh. And for 40 years, he leads the southern kingdom of Judah into horrible, terrible idolatry for 40 years. And eventually, that is God. Even though King Manasseh turns it around for about the last 15 years, he gets carried off into captivity, and he is sorry. And not just sorry he got caught. He comes home and he makes real changes. And they tear down idols all over Judah. And they worship only God. But it's too late. The people themselves have already followed him into that idolatry. And so eventually, what happens in the southern kingdom is that the Babylonian Empire comes in. And they harass them several times before this, make them pay tribute, carry off some of their young people by force. But in 586, I believe it is BC, King Nebuchadnezzar, we learn from history he's actually Nebuchadnezzar II of the Babylonian Empire, but the Bible just calls him King Nebuchadnezzar. He comes in and he flattens the city of Jerusalem. He squashes it, he carries everybody off, and sure, God had allowed invaders to harass the nation of Judah before that. But this is the big one. They get carried off and they are not allowed to be back for 70 years. And that forms a good chunk of the history of the Old Testament. We're going to talk a lot about that Babylonian captivity. But that's only what happens to the kingdom in the south. What happens to the kingdom in the north? Well, unfortunately, the kingdom of Israel in the north, they missed the boat from the beginning. You might remember that Jeroboam, the first king of the north, who broke away from the southern kingdom, and they started their own 10 tribes of Israel in the north, he set up 2 places for them to worship because he didn't think his people should be going down to Jerusalem all the time. That makes sense, right? He set up a golden calf in each place. They worshiped false god from the very beginning. And so in the north, you might remember, we don't have many dynasties in the north. A lot of the kings come to power by assassinating the guy who was already king. And then maybe his son reigns and his grandson reigns. But then his grandson gets assassinated by the next dynasty that comes along. And they rule for a little bit. And there's prophets everywhere because the people need the word of the Lord in these terrible times when these evil kings came and ruled. And we talked about Elijah and Elisha. And I'd love to tell all the stories of Elisha. But for hundreds of years, the northern kingdom of Israel really drops the ball. In fact, they didn't even have a ball. Like they just didn't have it from the beginning. We lost the ball. Didn't know we had a ball. It's just bad. And they wind up getting crushed by a large empire 200 years before the southern kingdom of Judah is destroyed by the Babylonian Empire. In fact, the Babylonian Empire hasn't even arisen yet. They have to get harassed. God uses other empires. In fact, before the story we tell today, it's the Syrian Empire. Starts with an S. And why I say that is because after that, it's the Assyrian Empire. And they're from a little bit different locations. So thank you, Lord, for making Bible history so much fun that everybody has the same name. Elijah, Elisha, Syria, Assyria. Oh well, we'll get over it. But in the north, from the land of Mesopotamia, where Abraham had originally come from, we have the Assyrian Empire. And before they totally flatten the nation of Israel and carry everybody off, or most of the people off, they come in and they harass. They come in and they make raids, and they have little skirmishes here and there, and little bitty Israel is up against this big empire. You know, when September 11th happened, we just memorialized that recently because the date rolled around again. You know, many of us, our reaction was, if we met a Muslim person, to automatically not trust them at all. And I'm privileged enough that my parents live near a university where they work with foreign students, and I know plenty of them. I've met plenty of young Muslim people. Some of them are very peaceful people, and some of them have been radicalized, and you should keep your eye on them and everything. But it's hard when you're having this conflict with another people. It's hard to just not hate them. It's hard to see that probably in their cities they probably just have average Joes, or what's the common name? I don't want to use Muhammad or whatever. Average Ali, you know, he just wants to work his job and go home to his kids or whatever. You know, it's hard. It's so hard to just say, you know what, I'll bet most of those people are people like you and me. It's probably just their leaders that are causing the problems. And I'm not trying to preach a message of tolerance for other peoples. Is a wonderful message, but that's not the focus this morning, although we do touch on it a little bit. But I want you to feel the depth of what Jonah felt. Because we don't want to laugh at Jonah for having the wrong attitude when we ourselves have the wrong attitude towards somebody. Towards somebody. It was fascinating. I was in college when we invaded Iraq. Because intelligence told us that it was Saddam Hussein's regime in Iraq who had supported bin Laden and the awful things that they did. Especially including September 11th. And so in 2003, I was actually in England as a student. That led to a lot of interesting conversations with foreign folks about whether we should be there or whether we shouldn't, whenever we first invaded in the springtime of 2003. And interestingly enough, you know, I went to get my Bible degree from our liberal arts Christian university, our Baptist university there in Hannibal, Missouri. Some of our guys were activated. They were National Guard or Army Reserve, and then they would come back. Guess what is now a town but was a city in Iraq? Nineveh. And the reason Nineveh is so important in this story is because Nineveh is the capital city of the Assyrian Empire that has been harassing Israel.